In the harsh winter of 1873, a lone settler's ingenuity would be tested like never before. With a glass front cabin and the weight of an unforgiving blizzard pressing in from all sides, he would face the ultimate challenge: survive the storm or lose everything. Before we dive into this incredible tale of survival, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this ignite your spirit for adventure, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode will push the limits even further. The wind howled through the valley, a relentless roar that seemed to stretch the very limits of nature's fury. Out in the wilderness, beyond the reach of towns, and far from any comfort, James Tanner stood before the cabin he had built with his own hands. The glass panes in the front of the cabin, rare for such an isolated settlement, gleamed in the weak afternoon light. But it wasn't the warmth of the sun that made them shine. It was the bitter bite of a storm that had come earlier than expected. James had spent the previous years preparing for winters like this, building a cabin that could stand against the wilderness, its stone chimney tall against the cold, its glass windows allowing him a view of the treacherous landscape. Yet even with all his preparations, he had never anticipated something this brutal. The snow had already begun to fall, thick and fast, covering the land in a heavy blanket, and the temperature dropped by the hour, plunging to levels that would make most men reconsider their existence in the mountains. Inside, the fire burned steadily, but James knew it wouldn't be enough. He had built the cabin for the long winters, with insulation and a solid structure that should have kept the cold out. But no matter how secure the walls, no matter how tightly the logs were fit, nature had a way of reminding man of his frailty. Outside, the wind screamed, rattling the windows and howling in the trees, the storm showing no signs of relenting. He walked to the door and pulled the fur-lined cloak tighter around his shoulders. He stepped out onto the porch, gazing out at the storm that had descended on his home with terrifying swiftness. The path he had cleared just the day before was already covered in snow. The world beyond was now a blur of white, the trees hunched beneath the weight of the snow, and the mountains in the distance barely visible through the thickening fog of frozen air. James knew that if he didn't act fast, his home could be buried under feet of snow before morning. The cabin, though sturdy, was not impervious to the fierce force of nature. He had to make sure the fire stayed burning, and he had to reinforce the windows before the storm could reach its full strength. Every instinct in him told him that tonight would be unlike any other night he had spent in the wilderness. With quick steps, James moved inside, grabbing tools from his collection of survival gear. As the wind howled louder, outside the sound reverberated through the cabin walls, echoing the deep, primal fears that clawed at his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that this storm, this blizzard, was different. It was as if the very wilderness had chosen him for a test that could either leave him in triumph or buried under the snow, forgotten by time. The night grew darker as the storm raged outside. James could hear the wind whistling through the cracks in the doorframe, and he cursed under his breath. He had always prided himself on being prepared, on having the skills to survive, no matter the circumstances. But even the best-laid plans had their limits. His cabin, built with care and precision, was holding up well. But there was something unnerving about the storm. It felt personal, as though the cold was trying to claim him. The temperature inside was dropping despite the roaring fire in the hearth, and James knew he needed to act quickly. He threw more wood on the fire, his breath fogging the air as he moved with urgency. The windows, the glass-fronted windows, were a source of both pride and concern. They allowed for a stunning view of the wilderness, a luxury most frontier cabins lacked, but tonight they felt more like a liability. The blizzard had picked up speed, and the snow, driven by the ferocious wind, was already beginning to pile against the glass. James had sealed the cracks in the cabin with mud and moss to keep the heat in, but the glass could only withstand so much pressure from the outside. He took the heavy canvas he had prepared earlier, a tool he'd learned to appreciate over the years, and carefully stretched it over the window frames. It was a slow process, but he was determined to block the cold from seeping in through every crack and crevice. With each layer he added, he could feel the warmth staying in the room longer, the cold gradually being kept at bay. But the battle was far from over. The wind howled louder as the hours passed, and the snow piled up deeper outside, pressing against the cabin walls. James could feel the isolation now, the vast wilderness surrounding him, and the feeling that the storm wasn't just a random event. It was something more. He had always known the land was unforgiving, but this felt different. This felt like nature itself was reaching out to test his strength. As the night wore on, James worked tirelessly to fortify his cabin. He piled more wood on the fire and wrapped himself in thick blankets, but the cold gnawed at him. The storm's fury had reached a new intensity, and it was as though the entire world was collapsing in around him. The windows groaned under the pressure of the snow, and James could feel the tension rising in his chest. He knew he had to hold on. Out there beyond the cabin walls, the wilderness had no mercy. It took what it wanted, and it didn't care who stood in its way. But inside, James Tanner wasn't about to let the cold win, not tonight, not when he had worked so hard to survive. The storm was far from over, but neither was James. The hours dragged on in a cold, haunting silence, broken only by the wind's howling fury outside and the occasional crackle of the fire. James had fortified every window, every crevice of the cabin, but still, he felt the weight of the storm pressing in on him. The glass-fronted walls that had once seemed like a symbol of his connection to the wilderness now felt like a vulnerability, an invitation for the storm to invade his home. The fire was his only defense against the freezing air creeping through the logs and settling into his bones. The heat from the hearth was barely enough to combat the biting cold that clawed at the cabin's edges, but it was all he had. James huddled close to it, feeling the warmth radiate against his skin, but his thoughts wandered. The storm outside felt different from any other he had faced before. It had a relentless nature, as if the blizzard itself had a purpose, something more than just a passing winter storm. James pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows across the cabin's walls. The cabin, his sanctuary in the wilderness, now seemed frail in the face of nature's wrath. He couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was testing him, pushing him to the brink of his endurance. His thoughts returned to the cabin's construction. He had taken great care in building it, placing every log with precision, sealing every gap as best as he could. But no matter how strong the foundation, how tight the corners, nature always found a way in. He had known that when he had built it. The glass windows, though a luxury, were now proving to be a liability. He could hear the wind battering against them, the snow piling against the glass, as if trying to force its way inside. James glanced around at the furnishings inside his cabin, the simple wooden shelves stocked with provisions, the hand-carved furniture, the small table where he had once sat to eat his meals. The life he had created in this remote wilderness was quiet but satisfying. But tonight, the wilderness felt like it was closing in on him, and the peace he had cultivated now felt fragile. The storm showed no signs of easing. In fact, it seemed to grow more violent with each passing hour. The air in the cabin grew colder, and James could feel the chill seeping into his limbs. He had always prided himself on being resourceful, on being able to handle whatever the wilderness threw at him. But tonight, even his skills felt inadequate. The storm was an adversary unlike any he had encountered. As he stared into the fire, he thought of his family back home, the life he had left behind. He had chosen this path for solitude, for the quiet challenge of surviving in the wilderness. But tonight, that choice felt lonelier than ever. He had built this cabin to withstand the harshest winters, but could it withstand the storm that had come? Would his ingenuity be enough to keep him alive? Or would he, like so many others before him, fall victim to the unforgiving wilderness? James took a deep breath and pulled himself from his thoughts. He couldn't afford to dwell on what-ifs. Not now. The storm wasn't going to stop just because he wished it would. He needed to keep his focus, to keep working, to ensure his cabin stood strong. The night was long, but his resolve was stronger. The storm raged through the night, a fury of ice and wind that seemed intent on testing James Tanner's every decision, every ounce of preparation. By morning, the snow had piled high against the cabin's walls, and the world outside was a white void. James had stayed awake most of the night, feeding the fire, checking the windows, ensuring that his shelter held firm against nature's violent assault. Despite his best efforts, the temperature inside had continued to drop, though not to life-threatening levels. Yet the uneasy feeling in his gut persisted. He stepped to the window, now covered in snow and frost, peering out at the blizzard's aftermath. The trees, once strong and tall, were bent under the weight of the snow, their branches heavy with the burden of the storm. The wilderness looked like an entirely different world, one swallowed by the storm's icy grip. But James knew that out there, beyond the cabin's walls, danger still lingered. Even the fiercest snowstorms had a way of bringing unexpected challenges. He turned away from the window, his gaze falling upon the cabin's construction. The glass-fronted walls, though sturdy and well-built, were beginning to show signs of strain. The storm had tested them to their limits. He could hear the faint creaking of the logs, the constant pressure of the wind against the glass. There was nothing more he could do now. He had already taken every measure he could think of to secure his shelter. The rest was up to fate. With a deep breath, James grabbed his coat and stepped out onto the porch. The air outside hit him with a biting force, the wind cutting through his layers of clothing. He had to move quickly if he was going to make sure his provisions were secure and that the storm hadn't caused further damage to the land around him. The snow was deep, reaching his knees as he trudged through the drifts. The cold seemed to seep into his bones instantly, but he knew he couldn't waste time. There was work to be done. The storm had left behind a beautiful but dangerous landscape. The wind had sculpted the snow into deep drifts, some of them almost as tall as he was. It was a testament to the storm's power, and James felt a growing sense of respect and fear for the forces of nature he had come to call home. The wilderness could be beautiful, yes, but it was also indifferent to the struggles of man. If he wasn't careful, if he didn't stay sharp, he would lose everything he had fought so hard to build. James checked his traps first, ensuring they were still functional and free from the heavy snow that had buried the landscape. His work as a trapper was essential to his survival, and without it, he would be left vulnerable. As he moved through the snow, his thoughts returned to the cabin. Would it stand strong against more storms like this one? Or had he miscalculated? The cold was relentless, but James had long ago learned to tune it out, to push through the discomfort and focus on what needed to be done. He couldn't afford to lose sight of his purpose, not when so much was at stake. The wilderness had a way of breaking men, and James Tanner was determined that it wouldn't break him. Not today. Days passed, but the storm did not relent. What had started as a passing winter squall had evolved into a relentless, unyielding blizzard that showed no signs of easing. James Tanner's cabin, once a symbol of his independence and resourcefulness, had become an island of warmth surrounded by a world swallowed whole by snow and ice. The fire burned steadily in the hearth, but the air inside was still cold, the chill creeping beneath the doorframe and through the seams of the glass. James spent much of the time inside, feeding the fire, checking the structural integrity of the cabin, and reinforcing any gaps where the cold might sneak in. He'd wrapped his windows with more layers of canvas and sealed the cracks with the clay and pine resin mixture he'd made. Still, the wind howled outside, and the temperature inside the cabin continued to drop slowly. It wasn't enough to freeze him, but it was uncomfortable, an ever-present reminder that he was at nature's mercy. But it wasn't just the cold he had to worry about. One morning, while checking his traps, James noticed something that sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. There was a crack in the cabin's foundation. It wasn't large, just a faint split that ran along one of the corners of the log structure, but it was there, and it was enough to make his heart race. The weight of the storm, the snow piling higher by the day, had started to take its toll. The foundation he had carefully crafted was beginning to show signs of strain, and if he didn't act quickly, the whole cabin could start to shift. He kneeled down to inspect the crack more closely, his breath clouding in the frigid air. The wooden logs had been carefully chosen for their size and strength, but even the best materials weren't immune to the stress of a storm like this. The snow had piled up around the cabin in thick drifts, pressing against the logs with incredible force. The foundation, meant to provide stability, was now becoming a liability. James ran his fingers along the crack, feeling the rough texture of the wood. It wasn't just the foundation that was affected. The entire structure had begun to settle under the weight of the snow. The walls creaked with every gust of wind, and James could feel the tension in the logs, the strain that had begun to spread through the cabin like a slow, creeping sickness. For the first time since the storm had started, James felt fear, a deep, visceral fear. He had built this cabin to withstand the harshest conditions, but nature had a way of making even the best preparations seem futile. What if the storm kept going? What if the snow piled up higher, the pressure building until the entire cabin collapsed under its weight? His mind raced with thoughts of what needed to be done. He couldn't let the cabin fall apart. He had worked too hard, built too much, and survived too long to let the wilderness claim it all now. There was no way he could abandon it, not now. He would have to act fast, reinforce the foundation, shore up the logs, and make sure that nothing could crack under the pressure. With determination set in his jaw, James returned to the cabin, gathering his tools. The storm may have been fierce, but he wasn't about to let it defeat him. The wilderness had tested him before, and it would again, but he would not go down without a fight. The crack in the foundation gnawed at James's mind, a persistent reminder of the precariousness of his situation. But he couldn't afford to focus on fear. He had always believed in preparation, in solving problems before they became catastrophes, and this crack was no different. It was a problem that needed solving, and fast. Inside the cabin, the fire still burned, though it was a soft glow now, barely enough to keep the chill at bay. The room felt colder than it had in days, and the creaking of the logs in the walls had become more frequent. James knew the storm was doing more than just testing his resolve. It was pushing his shelter to its limits. Every time the wind howled outside, the cabin seemed to shift, as if the storm itself was trying to tear it apart. James walked over to his workbench and began gathering the tools he would need. He had a small stash of iron brackets, some nails, and a heavy-duty hammer. The foundation needed reinforcement. The logs needed to be bound together more tightly. The snow outside had packed against the cabin like a vise, and the pressure was immense. It was a simple fix, really, reinforcing the cabin's corners and foundation with metal brackets, something that would provide the extra strength to keep the structure intact. But as he worked, he realized something. The storm wasn't just a physical battle, it was a mental one too. The isolation, the relentless cold, the ever-present fear that the cabin might collapse, all weighed heavily on him. James had chosen this life for the challenge, but it was hard to ignore the sense of being completely alone, the wilderness surrounding him with no one to rely on but himself. He worked through the night, hammering iron brackets into the logs, securing the foundation with more nails and braces. Each movement was a deliberate, measured action, but it was also an act of defiance. The storm might be relentless, the wilderness unforgiving, but James was not going to let it win. As the early morning light began to filter through the windows, the storm outside showed no sign of letting up. The snow continued to fall, covering everything in a thick blanket. The wind still howled, rattling the glass and shaking the logs. But inside, James had done everything he could. The cabin was as reinforced as it could be for now, and he had given it everything he had. The storm was still there, pressing against him, but he had fought back with everything at his disposal. He stepped back, surveying the work he had done. The cabin felt sturdier, more solid. It was still standing, and for now, that was enough. As long as he had this place to call home, as long as the fire burned and the roof held, he would survive. The storm outside wasn't finished, but neither was James Tanner. The storm stretched on, relentless and unforgiving, as the days blurred into one another. The snow kept falling, thick and heavy, burying everything outside the cabin beneath layers of cold, unyielding white. Inside, the fire flickered and crackled, but the warmth it provided was fleeting, consumed by the frigid air that found its way into every crack and crevice. James Tanner had been alone for weeks now, the isolation pressing in on him like the storm itself. He had built the cabin to survive the wilderness, to keep the elements at bay, but nothing could shield him from the growing weight of solitude. In the past, he had embraced the quiet, the peace that came with being alone in the wild. But tonight, with the wind howling outside and the world blanketed in snow, that same solitude began to feel suffocating. The fire was burning low, and James added a few more logs, watching the flames leap higher, casting flickering shadows on the walls. He had always been methodical in his work, a man of action, someone who found purpose in the labor of his hands. But tonight, there was little to do but wait. He had reinforced the cabin, checked his supplies, and ensured the fire stayed alive. And still, the storm raged on, as if time itself had frozen. James pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders and sat at the small table by the window. The view, once a comforting sight of the wilderness he had come to know and respect, now felt like a prison. The snow had piled high against the glass, and the trees outside were barely visible through the heavy snowfall. The world beyond his cabin had disappeared, swallowed whole by the storm. It wasn't the cold that bothered him most. It wasn't even the fear that the storm might one day break through the cabin's defenses. What troubled him now was the silence, the profound, endless silence that filled the cabin like an uninvited guest. He had grown accustomed to the noises of the wilderness, the howling wind, the rustling of trees, the crack of branches breaking under the weight of snow. But now there was nothing but the storm, and it felt as if it were closing in on him, forcing him into a corner of his own mind. James stood up abruptly, the weight of his thoughts too much to bear. He moved to the window and peered out into the swirling snow. There in the distance, he thought he saw something, a shadow. But the blizzard obscured his view, and it could have been nothing more than the shifting of the wind. Still, the momentary glimpse stirred something deep within him, a sharp, primal instinct that told him the wilderness had more to show him. He grabbed his rifle from the rack by the door and stepped outside, his boots crunching through the thick snow. The wind stung his face, and the snow whipped against his skin, but he ignored it. There was something he needed to see, something that had called him out into the storm. As he moved deeper into the snow, he felt the weight of isolation lift, replaced by a new sense of purpose. The storm might have stripped him of comfort and company, but it had also awakened something inside him. The wilderness was far from empty. It was alive, a force that could never be tamed. The storm had not abated, and James Tanner moved through it with a renewed sense of urgency. He had spent weeks preparing for the cold, but the storm had revealed something he hadn't anticipated. The wind had carried with it a sense of finality, as though the wilderness itself was testing him, not just for his ability to survive, but for his very will to continue. The shadow he had seen earlier, hidden in the depths of the snowstorm, now beckoned to him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the storm had been pushing him toward something. Whether it was simply a trick of his mind or a real presence in the wilderness, he wasn't sure. but the more he thought about it, the more he knew he had to follow it. James moved carefully, his steps slow but sure as he navigated through the knee-deep snow. The air was thick with frozen mist, and the howling wind made it difficult to see. Yet something urged him forward, guiding his every step. His breath came in quick puffs, clouds of vapor dissipating into the freezing air, but he didn't mind the cold. It had become a constant companion. Minutes stretched into hours as he pushed deeper into the storm. His rifle, now gripped tightly in his hands, was a comforting weight. He had always been a man of the land, familiar with the rhythms of nature. The forest around him, though swallowed by the snow, still whispered to him. The rustling of branches in the wind, the snap of twigs underfoot, the eerie silence punctuated only by the occasional howl of the storm. He had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and they had never failed him. But this time, he wasn't just relying on his senses. He was searching for something more. The wilderness had a way of revealing itself to those who knew how to listen, and James was listening now, more intently than ever before. Then, through the haze of the storm, he saw it. A dark shape moving in the distance, barely visible against the whiteout. It was large, larger than any animal he had seen before. And it moved with a deliberate grace that sent a shiver down his spine. Was it a bear, a wolf, or something else entirely? His heart began to race as he crept closer, his boots leaving deep tracks in the snow. The figure loomed larger with each step, and James felt a thrill of recognition, though he could not say why. The wilderness had never felt so alive. He raised his rifle, steadying his aim. The wind howled louder, but he focused. He had faced countless dangers before, grizzly bears, harsh winters, and unexpected blizzards. But this was different. The storm had drawn him here for a reason, and now it was time to face whatever lay ahead. The storm had closed in so tightly that the world beyond the cabin was little more than a shadow, a hazy blur through the swirling white of the blizzard. The figure that James had seen in the distance moved like a phantom, shifting through the snow with quiet intent. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of uncertainty pushing down on him with each step closer to the unknown shape. His rifle, still gripped tightly in his hands, was his only assurance. He had faced many dangers in the wilderness before, bears, wolves, harsh winters, but this felt different. There was an eerie calm about the snowstorm, a thick silence beneath the howling wind that made every movement feel amplified, like the world was holding its breath. As he crept forward, his boots sinking deeper into the snow with each step, the figure came into sharper focus. It wasn't a bear or a wolf, as he had feared, but something altogether different. A man hunched against the storm, wrapped in tattered furs. His face was obscured by the layers of cloth, but the silhouette was unmistakable. James's instincts told him to be cautious, but the man seemed as much a victim of the storm as he was. He stopped a few paces away, his breath coming in heavy clouds of vapor, the gun still raised, but now lowered slightly. The stranger didn't move, his body barely visible against the white landscape. James's mind raced. Was this someone from a neighboring settlement, or another lone traveler who had been caught in the same storm? "Hello?" James called out, his voice muffled by the wind, but still carrying across the snow. There was no answer. The stranger remained still, unmoving, his body hunched as though he were waiting for something. James took a cautious step forward, his eyes scanning the figure for any sign of movement. The storm howled around them, but the man did not seem to notice. He was a mystery, one that James could not ignore. He took another step, and this time the stranger stirred. Slowly he turned, his face hidden beneath the shadow of his fur hood. For a moment James thought he saw the glint of something, eyes perhaps, but they disappeared just as quickly. James's breath caught in his throat. This was no ordinary traveler. This was a man who had survived the storm, perhaps for far longer than he should have. There was a stillness about him, an unsettling presence that James couldn't quite place. He didn't know what to do, whether to approach or to retreat, but the silence between them stretched, suffocating. The man took a step forward then, his movement deliberate. For a long moment neither of them spoke, only standing amidst the storm's fury. And then, without warning, the stranger turned and disappeared into the white haze of the blizzard, vanishing as suddenly as he had appeared. James stood frozen, unsure of what had just happened. Had it been real? Was the storm playing tricks on him? He could still hear the wind howling, but the strange figure was gone, leaving James to wonder if he had imagined the entire encounter. James stood in the snow for a long moment, staring into the empty space where the stranger had just stood. The wind had picked up again, and the storm's howls seemed louder now, mocking him. The figure had vanished as quickly as he had appeared, leaving James with only a sense of confusion and an uneasy silence in the air. What had just happened? The logical part of his mind screamed that it had been a trick of the storm, his mind playing games with him. But there was something in the way the stranger had moved, in the deliberate slowness of his actions, that made James hesitate. He couldn't shake the feeling that the man was real, that he had come from somewhere, perhaps a neighboring settlement that had been cut off by the blizzard, or a traveler lost in the storm. Shaking off the unease, James decided to move forward. If the stranger was real, then he was out there somewhere, and there was no way James would leave him to die in the wilderness. The cold had already claimed so many, and he wasn't about to let another man fall victim to the same fate. He turned back toward his cabin, the wind biting at his face, and made his way toward the snowdrifts where he had last seen the figure. His thoughts raced with possibilities, but none of them felt entirely right. The storm had a way of stripping away any sense of certainty. It left nothing but the cold, the wind, and the biting realization that survival out here required more than just knowledge. It required luck. As James pressed on, the thought of returning to his cabin, to the warmth and comfort of the fire, seemed like a distant dream. The storm was so fierce, so consuming, that it made him question everything he had once known about the wilderness. Was his cabin truly a safe haven, or was it just another shelter, vulnerable to the harsh forces of nature? The deeper he ventured into the storm, the more he realized how isolated he truly was. The wind carried the scent of the snow, cold and sharp, and it was impossible to see anything more than a few feet ahead. He had lived in the wilderness for years, but this storm, this overwhelming force of nature, was unlike any other. James paused for a moment, standing still against the wind. His hands were numb from the cold and his breath fogged in the air. He had to decide. Did he return to the cabin and wait out the storm in solitude, or did he continue searching for the stranger, for some sign that he hadn't imagined the encounter? With a deep breath, he made his decision. He would keep moving forward. There was something in the wilderness that called to him, something that felt unfinished, something that demanded he see this through to the end. The storm might be unrelenting, but James Tanner had never been the type of man to let the wilderness dictate his fate, not this time. And so he pressed on, each step feeling heavier than the last, determined to uncover whatever secrets the storm still held. James's breath came in visible clouds as he trudged deeper into the blizzard, his boots sinking into the thick, wet snow with each step. The stranger, if he had even been real, was gone, leaving only the howling wind and the endless white of the storm. But something inside James refused to let go of the strange encounter. His instincts, honed over years of survival in the wilderness, told him that there was more to this than he could see. There was a reason he had seen the man, or at least thought he had, in the first place. The snow continued to fall in thick, heavy sheets, a constant blurring of the world around him. Visibility was nearly non-existent, and he could only make out the shapes of the trees, their branches weighed down with the weight of the snow. James moved carefully, his rifle still slung over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of the stranger, or something, anything that could explain what he had seen. He paused for a moment to catch his breath, leaning against a tree for support. The wind bit through his layers, and his fingers had long since gone numb. The cold was a constant companion now, gnawing at him, making every movement feel like it took twice the effort. But the feeling of isolation was worse. Out here, alone with only the storm as his company, the wilderness felt infinite. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, and every snowdrift seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. A faint trail appeared in the snow ahead of him. Footprints, barely visible but unmistakable in their pattern. They weren't his. They were fresh, still soft, as if someone had passed by moments before. James's heart skipped a beat. This could be the stranger he had seen earlier, or it could be someone else, another lost soul caught in the storm. Either way, it was a sign, and James knew he had to follow it. He bent down and studied the trail, noting the way the footprints seemed to weave and shift as though the person was moving erratically, perhaps struggling against the storm. James hesitated for a moment, the cold pressing into his bones, but he couldn't turn back now. He had already ventured too far, and something inside told him he had to see this through. The storm would not make it easy, but James had never been one to shy away from a challenge. He followed the trail carefully, moving slowly to avoid losing the footprints in the deep snow. With each step, the storm seemed to intensify, the wind howling louder, almost as though it were trying to push him back. But James pressed on, driven by a feeling he couldn't quite explain. A need to uncover the truth of what was out there in the storm, just beyond his reach. Minutes turned into hours as he followed the trail through the thickening snow, but there was still no sign of the person who had left the footprints. He was beginning to doubt himself, wondering if the trail would simply lead to nowhere. But then, just as he was about to turn back, he spotted a figure up ahead, standing still in the snow. James's heart froze. There, barely visible against the white backdrop of the storm, was a shadow. James's steps grew heavier as he approached the figure, the wind biting at his face, carrying snowflakes that stung like sharp needles. The shadow was no longer a mere silhouette. It was a man, standing motionless in the middle of the snowstorm. He was wrapped in thick, tattered furs, his face obscured by a heavy hood, and he seemed to be waiting for James to come closer. For a moment, James hesitated, the hairs on the back of his neck rising. This wasn't a bear or an animal. This was someone, a man just as lost in the storm as he had been. But the eerie stillness of the stranger sent a chill down James's spine. There was something about the man's posture, his complete lack of movement, that felt wrong. James took another step forward, his rifle still held loosely in his hands, though he wasn't sure why. The cold wind howled around him, and the snow continued to fall in thick, heavy sheets. The figure before him did not speak, did not acknowledge his presence in any way. James's mind raced with questions. Was this man another settler lost to the storm, or was he someone entirely different, someone who had been here long before the snow had begun to fall? "Are you lost?" James asked, his voice carrying over the wind, but barely reaching the stranger's ears. There was no response, only the soft shifting of the man's weight, as if he were considering whether or not to acknowledge James's question. James's fingers tightened around the rifle, but he didn't raise it. There was no immediate threat, but something about the man's silence unsettled him. It was unnatural the way he stood, unperturbed by the blizzard that raged around them. The storm had tested James's resolve, but this was something else. "Can you hear me?" James pressed, his voice rising above the wind. Still, the stranger didn't move. He just stood there, his body frozen in place. James took another step forward, closing the distance between them. As he did, the stranger's head slowly turned, just enough that James could make out the faint outline of his face beneath the hood. For a fleeting moment, their eyes locked, and James's breath caught in his throat. But then, in an instant, the man turned away, melting into the swirling storm, his figure disappearing into the white haze of snow. James's heart raced as he stood there, staring at the empty space where the stranger had stood just moments before. He blinked, unsure if what he had just witnessed had been real. The man had vanished, swallowed up by the storm, as if he had never been there at all. James's mind reeled with confusion, his heart still pounding in his chest. Had he imagined it all? Was the storm playing tricks on him, or had he truly encountered someone out there, someone who had somehow slipped into the blizzard and disappeared without a trace? The questions lingered in his mind as he turned back toward his cabin, the snow and wind pressing against him like an invisible force, trying to push him away from the wilderness he had come to understand. But as he walked through the storm, the unsettling silence remained, echoing in his thoughts long after the figure had disappeared. And though he could no longer see the figure or follow the trail, the feeling of being watched never quite left him. Something in the storm had changed, something deeper than just the blizzard's rage. James trudged back through the storm, his thoughts tangled and his heart racing. He had seen the figure, or thought he had, and now there was only the furious howling of the wind and the endless swirl of snow around him. The wilderness, which he had once embraced with calm certainty, felt strange, unfamiliar. It seemed as though the storm had become more than just weather. It had turned into a force that could warp reality itself. Every step he took toward the cabin felt more burdensome, as if the snow itself were pulling him back, slowing his progress. The weight of the encounter with the strange man, the way he vanished without a trace, had settled into his mind, gnawing at him. The storm felt alive in a way it never had before. Each gust of wind, each flurry of snow seemed like a whisper, carrying secrets he wasn't meant to hear. James's boots sank deep into the snow, his legs aching with the effort. He hadn't been out this long in the blizzard, and his body was beginning to protest. His fingers were stiff, numb from the cold, and his breath came in shallow gasps, the icy air burning his lungs. But despite the growing exhaustion, he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to keep moving, that the storm wasn't done with him yet. The cabin was still a long way off, barely visible through the thick curtain of snow. He stopped for a moment, adjusting the rifle across his chest, and looked around. The wilderness around him had turned into an endless sea of white. The trees, once familiar landmarks, were now just ghostly shapes in the swirling blizzard. There was nothing to orient himself to, no signposts to guide him home. And then he heard it, a soft sound, a murmur that was almost lost beneath the roar of the wind. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the snow. There was something else out there, something just out of reach, something that felt intentional. The whispers came again, faint but distinct. James's pulse quickened. The sound was almost familiar, like a voice calling from far away, urging him forward. He strained his ears, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but the storm seemed to distort the sound, making it impossible to tell. He couldn't explain it. The isolation, the loneliness, the fear of the storm, it was all starting to blur together. Was it the storm playing tricks on him? Was he just imagining things after hours of being lost in the blizzard? He shook his head, trying to clear the fog in his mind. He had to keep moving. He had to get back to the cabin. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more distinct. Now they weren't just a murmur. They were words, almost like a conversation, floating through the snow, and they were coming from somewhere behind him. With a deep breath, James spun around, raising his rifle, his body tense, ready for whatever was out there. But the snow was empty. The trees, the landscape, all still. The whispers had stopped. Silence fell again, thick and suffocating, the storm now seeming quieter, as if it too was waiting. James's grip tightened on his rifle, his mind raced, and he couldn't help but wonder if the storm was finally breaking him, if the isolation had driven him to madness. But even as the doubts swirled in his mind, there was one thing he was certain of. Whatever it was that had called to him, he wasn't alone out here. James stumbled forward, his feet dragging through the snow with growing weariness. The whispers were gone, vanished into the howling wind, leaving him with nothing but the weight of their echo in his mind. The storm, while fierce, seemed quieter now, as if it had faded into the background, allowing the unsettling silence to take its place. Every step he took toward the cabin felt like it required more effort than the last. The snow had piled higher, the path he had cleared earlier now buried under several feet of fresh powder. The wind had died down slightly, but the cold was relentless, seeping into his bones, numbing him. He could barely feel his fingers, his cheeks stiff with frostbite. His body screamed for warmth, for shelter, but the cabin seemed impossibly far away. Still, he pressed on, each step deliberate and heavy. He knew he had to get back. The encounter with the stranger, the inexplicable whispers, everything had unsettled him in a way that couldn't be ignored. The storm had become something more than just weather. It was a test, and it was one that James couldn't quite explain, but he knew he had to survive it. As he reached the final stretch of the trail, the trees that had seemed like sentinels now loomed like shadows, dark figures watching him. The cabin, his refuge, was in sight, a small speck of warmth in the vast, frozen wilderness. But as he neared it, something caught his attention. The door was ajar. James's heart skipped a beat. He was sure he had closed it before leaving. The lock, the heavy wood, the security, it had all been intact. Yet now the door was half open, swaying in the wind. A knot of fear tightened in his chest. His mind raced. Had someone gotten inside? Or was it just the wind causing the door to shift? His hand went instinctively to the rifle at his side, his steps cautious as he approached the cabin. He stopped just outside the door, listening intently. The cabin was eerily quiet, no sound of the fire crackling, no rustle of the wind against the roof. It felt wrong, as though the wilderness had infiltrated his home, creeping inside when he wasn't there. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open fully. The cabin was just as he had left it, almost. The fire still burned in the hearth, the warmth of the flames casting long shadows on the walls. But there was something out of place, something unsettling. James's eyes scanned the room, his gaze darting over the familiar furniture, the table, the shelves, the bed. And then he saw it. On the floor near the hearth was a footprint. It wasn't his. His pulse quickened as he moved toward it, his breath shallow. The footprint was fresh, the snow still soft where the sole had pressed down into the wood. It led toward the door he had left closed. Someone had been inside. Someone had been in his cabin. He spun around, the rifle now raised, his eyes scanning every corner of the room. He wasn't alone, not now, not in the place he thought was his sanctuary. The storm had brought something into his life, something he hadn't prepared for. And whatever it was far from over. James stood frozen in the doorway, the rifle gripped tightly in his hands, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. The footprint on the floor, fresh and deliberate, haunted him. Whoever had been in his cabin was still close, maybe even watching him. The silence was oppressive, stretching out between the flickering fire and the cold, empty corners of the room. The door creaked in the wind, still ajar, as if mocking him with its open invitation. James knew the door had been securely shut when he left. He had taken every precaution to make sure no one could slip past him, especially in the middle of a blizzard. But now, the cabin, his sanctuary, had been violated. Something, or someone, had entered in his absence. The fire crackled loudly, its light casting long, restless shadows across the wooden walls. James's eyes darted over every inch of the room, searching for signs of movement, for anything that might explain what had happened. But there was nothing. The room looked the same as it always had, the chair by the fire, the shelves of supplies, the bed where he slept. But it all felt different now, tainted by the strange footprint that marked the floor. He walked slowly into the cabin, keeping his rifle raised, every creak of the floorboard under his boots amplified in the silence. He was no stranger to danger. He had lived alone in the wilderness for years. But this was different. This wasn't the threat of a bear or a wolf. This was something more insidious, an unknown presence in a place he had always considered safe. The footprint seemed to lead toward the fire, where it stopped just at the hearth. It was as if the person, or whatever it was, had stood there, lingering near the warmth, before disappearing without a trace. The snow had been wiped away from the floorboards where the footprints had been, but the shape, the depth of the impression, was undeniable. Someone had been here. James exhaled sharply, his breath visible in the air. His fingers tightened around the rifle. He had to find out who, or what, was responsible for this intrusion. There were few people in these parts, and fewer still would brave the blizzard for any reason. But something about the way the footprint had appeared, as if it were waiting for him, set his nerves on edge. He moved carefully toward the bed, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The room felt suffocating now, as though the walls were closing in on him. He couldn't shake the sensation that something was just out of view, something that knew more about the storm and the wilderness than he did. As he reached the bed, he froze. A sound, a soft rustling, came from behind him. James spun around, his heart pounding in his chest, his rifle raised instinctively. His eyes searched the shadows, the corners, the dark places that hid nothing but the shadows of the storm. But the room was empty. The silence seemed to stretch out forever, until James finally exhaled, his grip loosening on the rifle. The room had betrayed him. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was palpable. Whoever or whatever had left the footprint was still near. But where? He couldn't explain it. The storm outside raged on, but the stillness inside was just as unnerving. James knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The wind continued to scream outside, its wails muffled by the thick walls of the cabin, but inside the air had grown dense with tension. James's hand still clutched the rifle, his knuckles white with the strain of holding it steady. The unease gnawed at him, an unshakable feeling that something, someone, was lurking just beyond the visible, just out of reach. He turned in a slow, deliberate circle, scanning the room again. Every shadow seemed to twist and bend, as if they were alive, waiting for him to make the wrong move. The faint rustling he had heard was gone, but the air still felt thick, charged with something unseen. Something wasn't right. James moved toward the table where he had left his map and journals earlier. His fingers brushed over the rough surface of the wood, tracing the lines of old notes, the sketches of the wilderness he had come to know so well. The pages had been left untouched, but now, in the dim light of the fire, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had shifted, as if something had disturbed them, rifled through his private thoughts. He picked up a page and examined it carefully. There were no signs of disturbance, just the neat scrawl of his handwriting. But the sense of something being out of place continued to weigh on him, pressing down on his chest like the storm outside. The strange man, the figure he had seen earlier, was still on his mind. The encounter was becoming harder to shake. James had been certain that what he had seen was real, but now, with the cabin breached, he wondered. Was it the storm playing tricks on him? Was he losing his grip on reality after so many days of isolation? Or had the figure been something else, something not entirely human? He set the map down, frustration creeping into his movements. This wasn't like him. He had always been clear-headed, focused on survival and the land. The wilderness had never lied to him before. But now, it felt like it was turning against him, like the storm itself was part of some larger, unseen design. The whispers from earlier still echoed in his mind, a haunting melody he couldn't escape. Suddenly, a loud crack from the corner of the cabin made James jump, his rifle instinctively raised. The fire flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. His breath caught in his throat. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of something moving in the shadows, something shifting, something waiting. This time James didn't hesitate. He moved toward the noise, his rifle raised and steady, his eyes sharp. The darkness in the corner seemed to pulse, the shadows deeper than they should have been. There, just on the edge of the firelight, was a figure, a shape too familiar, too unsettling. The stranger, but this time he wasn't standing still. The figure moved, a slow, deliberate shift, as if it had been waiting for James to approach. The storm howled outside, but the only sound inside the cabin was the slow creak of the floor beneath the figure's feet. James's pulse quickened. The figure was real. And it wasn't alone. The storm had come to claim him, and it had brought something worse than the cold, something he had yet to understand. James's heart pounded in his chest as the figure stepped closer, its movements fluid, almost unnatural. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, as if the wilderness itself were closing in on him. His rifle shook slightly in his hands, and his mind raced to make sense of the impossible. The stranger's face was still hidden beneath layers of cloth, his form shadowed and undefined, yet James felt the oppressive weight of its presence. The air between them thickened, as though the storm had gathered within the cabin itself. The figure raised a hand, a slow, deliberate gesture, and James instinctively lowered his rifle. There was no threat, no violence in its stance, just a quiet, chilling stillness. Then, without a word, the stranger turned and moved toward the door, disappearing into the blizzard's white haze. James's legs felt heavy, like lead, but he followed, compelled by an unshakable urge to understand what had just happened. Outside, the storm swallowed them both. The figure was just ahead, its shape barely visible in the whiteout. James followed into the unknown. The wilderness had claimed him, and now it was time to uncover its secrets. The storm's fury slowly receded, leaving behind a blanket of snow that had transformed the world. James stood alone, staring at the horizon. There was no sign of the stranger. The trail had vanished, swallowed by the relentless blizzard. The silence felt different now. The oppressive weight had lifted, leaving only the peaceful stillness of a world reborn. James's thoughts lingered on the encounter, on the stranger, on the whispers, on everything that had led him to this moment. The cabin stood behind him, its door now securely closed. The fire inside would burn through the night, keeping the chill at bay. For the first time in days, James felt a sense of peace. The storm had tested him, pushed him to the brink, but he had survived. As he gazed out over the snow-covered landscape, he understood something deeper. The wilderness wasn't just about survival, it was about embracing the unknown, accepting its challenges. He had done that, and now the storm was over. James turned toward the cabin. He had learned what he needed to. And as the first light of dawn touched the snow, he knew he was ready for whatever came next.